My name is Kat, and today I'm going to be going over some basic concepts in genetics. This is for a 200 level genetics class, so this is kind of assuming that you have a basic level of biology and microbiology. This is the second week of the class that I'm taking, so it is still kind of in the basic concepts. We're going to be looking at patterns of inheritance, then we're going to be looking at how to build a pedigree, and then we're going to have two different sets of terminology where we're going to kind of explore some concepts and how they relate to one another, especially as you get to explore how genetics becomes more in-depth and more complex. So let's start with patterns of inheritance. Patterns of inheritance. There are 5 main patterns of inheritance. We're going to be looking at autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. We're also going to be looking at sex-linked traits, which are genes that are located on your X or Y chromosome. There are X-linked dominant traits, X-linked recessive traits, and Y-linked traits. The DNA that are in your mitochondria have their own special pattern of inheritance, and we'll also go over that briefly. So starting off with the autosomal traits, which again are genes that are located on genes 1 through 22 for people. Everybody has these chromosomes, no matter if you're XX or XY. Starting with dominant traits. Dominant traits on an autosomal chromosome are expressed by anybody who carries even one of those alleles in their gene pair. For an autosomal recessive gene, both alleles of the gene pair have to match in order for that trait to be expressed in a person. If you have expressive offspring come from 2 non-expressive parents, then both of those parents must be heterozygous for that trait because both of them had to be able to pass on that recessive allele to that offspring. Sex-linked traits. So now we're looking at chromosomes that are either on your X chromosome or your Y chromosome, which means that they can be expressed differently. These are not the autosomal genes. Again, what those autosomal genes are 1 through 22, and this is your 23rd gene pair, which is either XX or XY. X-linked genes are genes that are carried on the X chromosome, and the phenotype of dominant or recessive is determined by how it is expressed in an XX person. An XY person is hemizygous for any characteristics that are on an X or a Y chromosome because the X and the Y chromosome are structurally distinct from one another, even though they're paired together. So an XY person is hemizygous for all sex-linked traits, whether it is on the X chromosome or their Y chromosome. Y-linked traits are specifically on the Y chromosome only. A trait that is on the Y chromosome can only be passed from an XY parent to an XY offspring. Earlier I mentioned that the genes within your mitochondria have their own special pattern of inheritance. Remember, the XX parent is the one supplying the egg for fertilization. The egg supplies all of the cytoplasm and organelles, and therefore all of the mitochondria that you receive are from your XX parent. X-linked dominant genes are found on the X chromosome, and whether it's dominant or recessive is determined by the phenotype that it displays in an XX person. An affected XY parent is going to pass that trait on to all of their XX offspring and none of their XY offspring because, again, to that fertilization event, they are contributing a sperm gamete with a Y chromosome to all XY offspring. When talking about an X-linked recessive trait, if you have an affected XX parent, that means that they must be homozygous for that recessive allele. So every offspring that they have, they are going to contribute that recessive allele on an X chromosome, whether those children are XX or XY. Therefore, all XY offspring will be affected from an affected XX parent. XX children from an affected XX parent will also be displaying that trait if the XY parent also is an affected person because an affected XY parent is hemizygous again for that recessive allele and they are only able to pass on a recessive X allele. But they don't pass anything on to their XY children. So an XY parent could be affected by this trait and yet not pass it on to any of their XY children. We're going to talk through an example of this looking at a trait that is X-linked recessive, and that is color blindness. Now, this is actually, there are 3 different kinds of color blindness. We're only talking about 2 different kinds because one of the kinds of color blindness is actually on an autosomal chromosome and is a little bit different in its behavior. So we're only looking at red and green color blindness, which are both X-linked recessive traits. The question is, what is the chance that a carrier XX person and a colorblind XY person will produce A colorblind child that is XX, and B, a colorblind child that is XY? So, Punnett squares. I've made a Punnett square for this question. The XX person is a carrier, which means that they have a circle with a little dot inside of it, and that means that they don't display the trait itself, but they have the capability of passing that allele on to their offspring. There is also a colorblind XY person, and we shade in the square to show that they exhibit the trait, which is, again, red or green colorblindness. XX has a dominant allele and a recessive allele. We know that they have a dominant allele because they don't display the trait of colorblindness. So the dominant allele allows them to have regular sighted vision. They do have that recessive allele, and that's why they are able to pass that on. So in answer to the question, what is the chance that a carrier XX person and a colorblind XY person will produce a colorblind child that is XX? The answer is 1 in 4. So because 1 in 4 of these options ends up with a colorblind child that is XX. If someone were to ask you, what is the chance that an XX offspring is colorblind, that's 50%, because half of the XX offspring were colorblind and half of the XX offspring were carriers for it. Continuing on to B, the question is, what is the percentage of a colorblind child that is XY? We can look at the squares. 1 in 4 of these options is a colorblind XY child. Again, if you're to look at what is the percentage chance of an XY child that is colorblind, it will be half. Roughly half of the XY children produced from this union would be regularly sighted and unable to pass this trait on to their offspring in the future. This is the first of 5 videos.